Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest, Professor Jennifer Bonnell. She's a historian of public memory and environmental change in 19th and 20th century Canada. After her first degrees from University of Victoria and a PhD from U of T in history, she's on faculty at York University. Her achievements include books about many regions and topics, including British Columbia and beekeeping. Her work has received several awards from government and academic organizations, several for her 2023 book called Stewards of Splendor, A History of Wildlife and People in British Columbia. One of her current projects, which we were just chatting about, is bringing Indigenous history to Black Creek Pioneer Village. In all, hers is a topical and very intriguing program of scholarship. Her focus today will be on her work on a topic of great interest to us all, Toronto's Don River Valley. Her book, Reclaiming the Don, An Environmental History of Toronto's Don River Valley, was published by the University of Toronto Press in 2014, with a second edition released in 2024. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bonnell.
Got all my various things. Hello, everybody. It looks like I am centered in the Zoom room. Is that looking good? Okay. Well, thank you very much to Susan Houston and members of the Senior College Executive for inviting me here to speak this afternoon. Today, I'd like to introduce some of the central themes of my book. Is that advancing?
Nope.
Okay. We just needed the right touch. Did you want me to wait all the same? So go ahead. Fingers crossed. Okay. All right. We're going to begin again. We seem to have sorted out the problem. So today I'd like to introduce some of the central themes of my book, which, as Susan mentioned, came out in second edition in 2024. One of the first questions I always get about my research is, why the Don? Why explore the history of a small, neglected urban river? Well, the rivers that I grew up with, the Cowichan and the Chemainus on Vancouver Island, were real rivers by comparison. But I was fascinated by what I found when I moved to Toronto over 2 decades ago, that really, despite its condition, Torontonians gravitated to the Don as an escape from the monotony of the urban grid, perhaps, a quiet, leafy retreat from the city around it, or a place to try to restore and improve. That vision of a restored urban green space that has compelled so many citizen activists to spend their weekends planting seedlings and pulling tires out of the river, and their weekday evenings attending municipal planning meetings. I was interested, in other words, in how the river came to be the place it is today and why people cared so much about it. How did we get here? So in my talk today, I'll highlight 2 central tensions in how people perceived the valley over time, and talk about how they were involved in creating the place as we know it today. The first, I'll get there, is a tension between perceptions of the valley as, on the one hand, a desirable landscape for agricultural settlement, and on the other, a dangerous and difficult landscape best converted to a site for industry and a sink for urban wastes. And also a second and related tension between perceptions of the valley as a corridor and perceptions of the valley as a place. So those themes are going to animate my talk throughout today. But to begin, a bit of a primer on this place. So Toronto's Don River Valley is really, quite small by watershed, compared to other watersheds in Canada. The river's only 38 kilometers long, and it flows through one of Canada's most urbanized watersheds, which will be no surprise to anyone in this room, running from the Oak Ridges Moraine in the north to Lake Ontario east of the city core. And the study of the human history of the valley reveals a very long history of settlement and use. Archaeological evidence has shown use of the valley by indigenous groups beginning soon after glaciers retreated about 11,000 years ago. The Seneca, a Haudenosaunee nation, hunted and fished in the valley in the 1660s and had village sites at the mouth of the Humber and the Rouge. So the Don was sort of a secondary site of interest for the Seneca. Following their withdrawal at the end of the 17th century, the Mississauga, an Anishinaabe nation, moved into the Toronto area and hunted and fished in the valley. And this image, a bit fuzzy, is of the Menominee on the Fox River, but certainly similar activities of hunting or fishing by torchlight have been documented on the Don. My book, though, focuses on what is really the shortest period in the valley's history, the history of European settlement from 1793 to the present. And it was what I found was that this small river at the city fringe played a surprisingly large role in the city's development. It acted as a source of raw materials, a corridor for transportation, first for rail in the 1880s and later for automobiles in the 1960s. It served as a site for industry and a sink for wastes. So the city shaped the valley, and the valley shaped the city. The city, of course, transformed the valley, polluting waterways, filling wetlands, and leveling hills. But the valley, in turn, constrained eastward expansion and frustrated development initiatives really until the early 20th century. So this is an image of the Bloor Street Viaduct under construction in 1915, which really enabled the eastward expansion of the city. Before that, this wide valley in the lower part of the city made for a very difficult crossing. The river valley, though, also claimed an important place in the history of ideas about the city and its future. From the 1790s to the present, the valley functioned as a kind of canvas upon which to cast what I call imagined futures for the city as a whole. From colonial era settlers and officials who saw in the valley a kind of pastoral landscape reminiscent of Britain and suitable for future agrarian settlement. This was one of those kind of imagined futures for the Don. To 19th century civic politicians and industrialists who saw here an industrial hub to fuel the city's growth. And later to conservationists like Charles Sorial, who saw in the valley a vital green corridor within which to revitalize harried urban minds and bodies. To mid-19th century or mid-20th century politicians like Frederick Gardner, who saw the valley as a natural corridor through which to stitch together a regional transportation system. So really kind of competing imaginations for the future of this place. This metaphor then of reclaiming the Don that I've used becomes not only a reference for physical reclamation, filling the swampy wetlands of the lower river, but also to the individuals and groups over time who sought to reclaim the valley for visions of their own. One of the most powerful ideas that emerged about the valley beginning in the early 19th century was its perception as a kind of repository for undesirables, a place for the city's sewage and industrial wastes, and a place to house undesirable human populations. In other words, a place to tip things you didn't want to look at too closely or smell. In my research, I uncovered evidence of the history of homelessness in the river valley dating back to the early 1800s. In the 1860s and 70s, the lower river valley was a popular location for squats, for gangster activity, and rough working class pursuits, such as taverns like this one, the Don Vale House, pictured here right on Winchester Street near the river in the 1870s. These were the kind of places that permitted blood sports, boxing, and cockfights well into the late 19th century. So this kind of wooded area at the edge of town provides the kind of distance and seclusion that mattered for activities like this. So the valley kind of becomes perceived by respectable citizens in the town center as an underworld of sorts, a place of danger and ill repute. And what I found was that these perceptions had a really long history, rooted in a historical shift from an understanding of the area as a source of valuable commodities and desirable real estate, to perceptions of it as an area for undesirables, a site for industry, and a dumping ground for the city's wastes. So I'll outline some of the processes that were involved in this shift. So when Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe established the settlement of York in 1793, he chose the eastern end of the Toronto Harbor as a site for his town plot, and you can see that sketched here in the top right of the image. This is a plan of York from 1818. Has a nice view of the Don on the far right with the marshes surrounding the very windy lower river. Simcoe chose this site for its natural defensibility and its potential to supply the future town of York with lumber and clay. So really many brickyards come to locate in the lower valley, and the white pines located further north were important for ship masts and construction. Simcoe establishes a 400-acre reserve for government buildings west of the river, and you can see that sketched here running down. It says Government Park, right to the left of the Don running in this image. And York's first Parliament buildings were erected here in 1794. So the Don really has this prominent role in early imagined futures for the settlement of the town of York. Further upstream, prominent men in Simcoe's inner circle received what were considered choice farm lots for agricultural settlement and country estates. And the valley provided, as Simcoe anticipated. At the peak of water-powered milling in 1860, the watershed supported over 50 mills on its 3 branches, which is kind of hard to imagine today, this small river hosting so many mills of different kinds. And the Taylor Brothers paper mill, the image I started with, this is from 1860, was one of those, known as the Middle Mill on the east side of the Don, just a bit northeast of their lower mill at Todmorden Mills. What Simcoe didn't anticipate, though, during his really brief stay at York, was the influence of the wide, shallow marsh stretching south and east of the river mouth on the health of York's future inhabitants. You can see that marshland really well in this image. His choice of site for the capital of Upper Canada was based on really necessarily hasty assessments of the economic and strategic potential of Toronto Bay. An almost inevitable aspect of life in Upper Canada in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, though, was what was known as the lake fever, or ague, that tormented settler populations each summer with alternating symptoms of severe fever and shaking chills. Mm-hmm. Of course, we now understand this as a strain of malaria. Malaria, of course, spread by the bite of the Anopheles mosquito. At the time, the ague was thought to result from inhaling bad air, hence malaria.
Mm-hmm.
Gases produced by decomposing organic matter took on the ominous label of miasmas, disease-producing vapors. And the places where such organic matter accumulated, such as swamps and wetlands, became places to fear, avoid, and best yet destroy through drainage and fill. Areas around the mouth of the Don were viewed as a diseased landscape from the earliest days of settlement. And I'm borrowing from a later image here. This is Asperger's Marsh in 1909. So here is Toronto printer John Bennett writing to an acquaintance in September 1801, so almost a century earlier than this image. I am just recovering from a severe fit of fever and ague which confined me to bed for 10 days past. Nobody can escape it who pretends to live here. There is a marsh about a half a mile from where I live, which a thick fog arises from every morning. People attribute the fever in great measure to that and to the low and uncultivated state of the country. So a beautiful little gold mine for me as the historian finding that quotation. Before the discovery of the malaria parasite in 1880 and subsequent discoveries of mosquitoes as vectors of transmission, places themselves were thought to make you sick. Certain environments were considered more unhealthy than others. So elevated sites with fresh circulating air were considered salubrious. And, this might be familiar to many of you in the audience. Low, marshy areas where air and water alike were thought to stagnate were considered unhealthy and malevolent. Ironically, though, despite mistaken theories about the origins of disease, fears of miasma were not entirely misplaced. The slow-moving waters of the Don marshes would have provided an excellent breeding ground for mosquitoes, and efforts made to avoid these unhealthy places and to shut out the dangerous night air often had the effect of shutting out mosquitoes as well. So these perceptions of undesirability from very early on, really well before sewage and industrial pollutants come to foul the river and its surrounding wetlands. By the 1830s, you see the city responding to this with evidence of growth away from its original, anchor in the southeast. The city starts to move north and west in direct association with these ideas about a diseased environment around the mouth of the Don. In 1833, for example, Lieutenant Governor John Colborne explained the westward expansion of the city as the only reasonable option. The eastern part of town, he mentioned, is affected by the effluvia of the marshes of the Don, and the rapid increase in population requires that the town should be extended towards the westward, the most salubrious and convenient site. And Toronto did indeed lean west in the decades that followed, pulling away from that site of the original plot near the mouth of the Don. Parliament moved to new and more fashionable quarters in the west end of town at Front and John Streets in 1832. And the desirability of West End real estate and the corresponding undesirability of the East End increased accordingly, and we can still see those trends in our current landscape. Right? When the city, speaking as an East Ender, when the city incorporated in 1834, the lower river came to represent an official margin, its curving course forming the eastern border of the city. And you can see that a little bit in this image of the city in 1866, the border of the city of Toronto, the lower Don actually forming that border. The extension of the Grand Trunk rail line across the eastern waterfront in the mid-1850s, and that's also visible on this map, provides a stimulus to industry. So we see this kind of series of events related to this early undesirability. This is one of my favorite images from the City of Toronto archives. It required them to bring out their biggest scanner to deal with this really big document for this project. And this demonstrates the plan for the straightening of the Lower Don River in the 1880s. And this was hatched both to further facilitate industrial development and to create new land for industry. So the map kind of identifies the number of expropriations of properties along the Lower Don. But as we'll see, it also creates great profits for both the city and some of the landowners in this area. One of the most important propellers of this project, though, is the CP rail line. So up until this point, CP had been bringing their trains across the city to the west end and backing them into the city. They were seeking a straight line down to be able to move along the eastern waterfront and back out the west side. So it's really hard to run a rail line along a curvy river. Mm-hmm. And this project really moves from the planning table onto the ground as a result of lobbying from the rail industry. And what's interesting here is an area kind of once vilified as diseased, coming to be understood as a providential site for industrial development. As the Toronto World put it in 1884, every city that has manufacturing industries has a district set apart therefore. And the Don is the district that nature and expedience have set apart for Toronto. So this detail shows a bird's eye view image of the city in 1893. It's from the Toronto Public Library collections. This is just a small portion of that much larger image. But it really gives a sense of the industrial development facilitated by proximity to rail, and the corralling, at least mostly successful, of what was a surprisingly unpredictable and destructive river in the decades before this. I don't really have time to go into detail, but suffice it to say that, we see rail really propelling this development, propelling the changes to the river. And city politicians also stood to gain as several owned lands along the river whose property values stood to increase with rail access and industrial expansion. Promises to residents included an end to the destructive flooding and ice jams that the Don had become famous for, as well as a mechanism in this straightened canal, conceivably to flush pollutants out into the lake. It didn't really work out that way, as I detail in the book. Pollution, for example, was not much abated. Industrial pollutants combined with sewage waste led to extremely polluted conditions along the river in the 1890s. For example, an article in the Toronto Mail in 1894, 3 years after the straightening was completed, described the lower river as a pestilential channel whose waters had taken on a yellowish green color and a slimy soup-like consistency. There were so many wonderful sources like that. Flooding also remained a problem, and this is an image from 1920 of the Lower Don in flood from the City of Toronto archives. So all of those promises about a much cleaner river that would stop destroying properties, stop taking people's lives through twice annual flooding, don't really come to pass. I'm going to turn now to another aspect of my research, and that looks at who called the valley home in this period. So my research also looked into the social history of the valley, and over time, really revealed some interesting parallels. Which groups, I wanted to know, used the valley in different periods, who moved through it, what traces did they leave? One of the most discernible 19th century uses of the valley was the development of institutions for quote-unquote undesirable populations in the lower valley beginning in the 1860s. So just as the valley had been used as a place to receive the city's wastes and to store lumber, coal, and other flammable materials away from residential neighborhoods, so it was also used as a place to store undesirable human populations. This image shows the industrial house of refuge, a place for the poor and mentally ill, which later became the Toronto Isolation Hospital for Infectious Disease and is now, I believe, the site of Bridgepoint Health. The Don Jail was just to the south of this building. And another example, in the 1940s, a prisoner of war camp was located at the site of Todmorden Mills. Prisoners here worked at the nearby Don Valley Brickworks. So again, the idea expressed here of the valley as a place for both material and human populations, things that were best out of sight, out of mind. Why here? Why did these institutions choose to locate in the valley? Well, one, because land was cheap. The character of these institutions also led them to seek a landscape removed from the city, and one that had, ironically, restorative characteristics. So in seeking a site for the Don Jail in the 1850s, the proponents of the project sought arable land to support a jail farm, and this was a really significant factor in their search. These institutions left a body of records as to their rationale for locating in the Don. Others, however, who occupied the valley left very little. For example, I found evidence of people living rough in the valley from the 1820s on. For example, the 19th century historian Henry Scatting referenced a hermit squatter by the name of Joseph Tyler, who lived, quote, in an excavation along the side of a steep hill above the riverbank near Queen Street in the 1820s. He had a large garden just south of there where he grew sweet corn and tobacco. In the 1860s, members of the Brooks Bush Gang squatted in an abandoned barn near today's Withrow Park, a group of women and men who were regularly in and out of the Don Jail for drunkenness and robbery. Their lives can be glimpsed through the trial record for the murder of John Sheridan Hogan, a Toronto MPP who was murdered on the Queen Street Bridge in 1859 and his body tossed into the river. Their debauchery and criminal behavior aside, reading between the lines of the trial gives a glimpse of the life experience of some of the accused and shows a history of seasonal labor and injuries on the job and really the absence of a social safety net in this period. In the 1910s and 20s, several groups of Roma travelers established temporary camps in the valley, and the records can be glimpsed in the local newspapers about these encampments. So they're just one of a long series of people living rough in the valley for various reasons. The river valley for them and for others provided a source of sustenance and livelihood. For example, access to water for drinking, for cooking and bathing, to driftwood for cooking fires, to fish, and to grasses for basket making. And there's been some historical work on Roma travelers gathering grasses to sell baskets at St. Lawrence Market, for example, in the 1920s. Of course, it also provided a degree of refuge from authorities. In 1930 to 31, unemployed men followed in this pattern and formed a large hobo jungle on the flats of the river. By the summer of 1931, 400 men were camped in shanties and sleeping on the banks of the river. And the railway plays a role in bringing these men into town. There was kind of a tacit agreement with police, apparently, that if they jumped off the rail cars before coming into Union Station, that the police would sort of turn a blind eye to this. The camp, however, was later demolished by local police, and the men drafted to work on the Trans-Canada Highway project in Northern Ontario in the fall of 1931. In each of these cases, an industrial landscape little valued for other uses was somehow available for opportunistic travelers. You can think of this as a difficult landscape, one of steep ravines and marshy lowlands. It prevented a space, of course, that was unattractive to many residents of the center, and in that way provides refuge for temporary campers or longer-term squatters through the entire history of the time I looked at this valley. There was an ability, in other words, to disappear into kind of a remnant of wilderness in the heart of the city. Turning now to that third and final theme I wanted to cover today, and that's the tensions in the history of the valley between its perceptions as a corridor and perceptions as a place. A corridor for trains, for ship traffic, for automobiles and gas lines, or a place as a kind of vital urban green space to be cherished and protected. Visions of the valley as a kind of cherished place are present in the very first written records. Elizabeth Simcoe's use of the valley in the 1790s as a kind of retreat in times of illness, a destination for picnicking parties in summer, is an early expression of this broader trend. Beginning in the 1940s, urban conservationists were drawn to the valley, and particularly its largely rural landscapes north of Bloor Street, as a fragment of wildness in the city that had the potential to restore, as I've said, harried urban minds and bodies. The most prominent champion for the conservation of the valley with these kind of visions in mind was Charles Sorial, who lived a very long 20th century life from 1904 to 1995. Sorial was especially interesting because he was not only a vocal advocate for the conservation of the valley beginning in the 1940s, but because he was also a seasonal cottager in the valley. Every summer, his family packed up and moved from their Toronto home near Broadview and Danforth to a cottage near the Forks of the Don, just a few kilometers away. They stayed this summer, every summer, for 41 years, between 1927 and 1968. And here, Sorial planted an extensive vegetable garden and orchard. He tended honeybees, and he engaged in reforestation efforts upon what became growing valley holdings through the 1930s and 40s. He bought up a lot of land from the rail companies for very little, most of which was denuded, so Sorial set about to plant a lot of trees. He made such a compelling subject for study, in part because he left behind such a rich record of his life experience. He was the author of 6 books about his experience as a conservationist, an apiarist, and a cottager in the valley, together with numerous unpublished manuscripts and regular diary entries throughout his life, and these are all available at the City Archives. Sorial founded the grassroots Don Valley Conservation Association in 1949, responding to ongoing perceptions of the valley as a kind of dumping ground. And here, these are images from the Conservation Authority's branch photo albums of some of the trash dumps in the valley in the 50s. But also to ideas about the valley as a kind of unregulated green space. Early activities of Sorial's Conservation Association were largely directed at children, for example, who were chastised for shooting songbirds and hacking saplings. Wouldn't that be amazing if that was the biggest problems we had to deal with today? Sorial later goes on to chair the fundraising body of the Don Valley Conservation Authority, so a precursor to the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority today, created under the Provincial Conservation Authorities Act. His experiences in the valley point to this larger conflict between perceptions of the valley as a corridor and perceptions of the valley as a place. And if Sorial personified the latter, perceptions of place, a place to improve and to protect, it was Frederick Gardner, the chair of the Municipality of Metropolitan Toronto from 1953 to 1961, who, probably no surprise to this audience, personified the corridor perception. Gardner was described by his biographer as possessing a, quote, fascination with building modern multi-lane highways, and he was renowned for his bullish tactics in pushing projects to completion. The story of the development of the Don Valley Parkway in the late 1950s and early 60s brings these two men together, and also their competing visions for the valley. So the DVP brought to fruition half a century of visions for the valley as a high-speed transportation corridor. So really, as early as 1914, there are plans in the books to create a roadway through the valley. A roadway or a beautiful parkway, they sort of alternate every 20 years, building upon its earlier function, of course, as a rail corridor since the 1880s. For Gardner, the parkway represented the best use of a blighted and underdeveloped space. And the parkway was quite unusual in the broader context of Toronto expressway developments in the high level of consensus that surrounded its development. So unlike the Spadina Expressway plans of the early 1970s, which caused such heated public opposition, the DVP was relatively friction-free. Few homes stood in the way, and few people objected. So within this context, Sorial's opposition to this highway, he was really a kind of voice in the wilderness. As we all know today, it's Gardner's imagined future for the valley that wins out here. The Don Valley Parkway was completed in 1966, simplifying the environment of the lower valley to support a high-speed roadway flanked by a recreational parkland that, of course, we're all pretty grateful for mostly today. It was widely viewed at the time as a kind of triumph of civilizing forces over a blighted space. As Gardner retorted in 1961 in response to a council member lamenting the loss of valley woodlands, the Don Valley was a place to murder little boys. That's what it was. So here we can see how the collective memory of the valley as a kind of unsavory, somehow deviant place played an important role in mobilizing public support and ultimately transforming the landscape. Sorial's story had a very different ending. The road would run directly through his orchard and the site of his cottage, wiping out, he wrote bitterly in 1956, the work of 30 years. In the end, Sorial was expropriated from his property on the Don not once, but twice. First for the DVP in 1958, after which his family kind of demonstrates quite a bit of pluck and just relocates across the river to another cottage that they owned. But secondly, and most ironically, he is expropriated once again in 1968 within the context of floodplain acquisition by the Metro Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. So in the aftermath of Hurricane Hazel, the Conservation Authority is trying to buy up a lot of lands in the valley to discourage any kind of human occupation in the floodplain. And of course, this was an organization that Sorial had been deeply involved in, had participated in as a board member, and been involved in bringing together some of those land acquisitions. The DVP transforms the geographical significance of the valley, I argue, from a dumping ground at the old city's edge to a vital corridor of movement through the center of a larger metropolitan region. The valley, as a former barrier to eastward expansion, had shaped the city, and the city, through the completion of the DVP, shaped the valley. Soriol's efforts, though, and those of the activists that followed them, weren't completely in vain. In the period after Hurricane Hazel struck southern Ontario in 1954, the valley has been revalued as a recreational landscape. Land acquisitions by the Conservation Authority played a big role in this. Parklands created that could now be enjoyed by city residents. But in the same period, Gardner's Metro Toronto government made massive investments to improve sewage infrastructure, meaning you could now take a picnic in the valley without the smell of the place ruining your experience. In 1989, Soriol's beloved East Don Valley was protected as the Charles Soriol Conservation Reserve, and here, unlike the more predictable recreational park spaces in other parts of the valley, it's still quite possible to get lost. But I think it's safe to say that Gardner's corridor function triumphed in the end. Today, the DVP has become synonymous with the valley itself. References to the Don Valley on the radio are shorthand for the DVP. The place has become the road. For most Torontonians, the view from the windshield on their daily commute is their only contact with the river valley. But I suggest its historic functions remain. As Waterfront Toronto's recently completed work to decontaminate and redevelop the area around the mouth of the river shows us, the valley remains a place upon which to cast visions for the future of the city. It also maintains its function as a repository for undesirables. Makeshift tents of the homeless can still be seen on the banks of the river in the lower valley. And the city continues to use the valley as a receptacle for huge amounts of filthy, salt-laced snow from the city's roads. So just as it did in the mid-19th century, the valley continues to provide kind of hidden services to the city as a sink for wastes. Treated effluent from the North Toronto Sewage Treatment Plant currently makes up a significant portion of the river's flow. As a drainage for floodwaters, we're grateful for that as we see the river rise in periods of high rain. As a corridor for wildlife, coyotes and bats are apparently on the rebound. As a refuge for homeless people. And in providing these kind of hidden services, I think we can argue it makes the city more habitable. And I'll close there. Thank you.